Now, I'm not going to introduce the speaker today. Instead, I'm going to introduce someone to introduce the speaker. And I'm going to introduce to you someone most of you probably already know, and that is Kathy Turner. She has been a member of the Evans Library for more than 30 years, and now she's librarian emerita. But she comes here, I think, almost every week to volunteer in the archives. So she is still a real vibrant part of the library, and we love her. So, Kathy?
Thanks, Lee. Good evening. I am so delighted to be back here at the Evans Library as part of the Library After Hours program. And I'm very honored to introduce to you all Dr. John Baggett as he brings to you a white Southern man's journey through the civil rights era. John Baggett is Southern, as you will hear. He is white, as you can see. And his journey has been remarkable, important, and significant. I look forward to your hearing about that. John Baggett's doctorate is in psychiatric anthropology and his master's in anthropology of religion. He has had and continues to have many roles, but tonight he will speak to you about his role as activist. Personally, I knew I needed to listen to what this man had to say about civil rights when, in a rather casual conversation, he said, "Yeah, I was on the plane with Coretta Scott King." So I knew that he knew a thing or two about this. Not only has John Baggett been deeply involved in civil rights, but also he's been very involved in mental health. He served as executive director of the National Alliance for Mentally Ill North Carolina, NAMI, and the director of the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. He is an expert on grief counseling and continues to this day to provide counseling locally. John and his wife Diane, who is also a counselor, professional counselor, facilitate several support groups. Let me take a little segue and tell you about that. A mental health fair that they are coordinating is taking place soon, and I want you all to know about it. Help and Hope for Mental Health Challenges will be held on Sunday, October 27th at 2 o'clock, and there are flyers in the back. This event on site, there will actually be representatives from a variety of community resources, mental health experts who will be available to answer questions, and presentations from distinguished speakers. So as I said, the flyers are on the back, and these topics are very timely, and I hope if anyone has any interest in mental health challenges, you will attend. Now, back to this. Okay, related to his life's work, John is an author, a blogger, a retired pastor, a counselor, an oil painter, and one of the few people that I know who, for fun, read our son's dissertation. So he's a cool guy. So anyway, please welcome Dr. John Baggett.
That was not an easy dissertation to read either. You can tell Philip I said that. It's a great honor for me to be with you tonight, and I see a lot of familiar faces and some that are less familiar, but very nice looking. And I'm just delighted to be a part of this event. What a great thing that FIT does to have these after-hours library events. And I'm just indeed privileged to be a part of this. Kathy gave you a little background about me. I want to talk tonight a little bit about about nonviolence. I want to talk a little bit about the background of the civil rights movement, because when I tell my story of my involvement, you will be able to understand why I was involved and what a difference the movement made. Because, I find a lot of people don't know some of this history. Those of us who are seniors didn't get taught much of it in school, whether we are white or black. And those of us who are young didn't live through it. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of history through it, but I'm going to weave into it my own personal story of my journey in the civil rights movement. But I've also talked some about growing up in the segregated South. Before I do that, though, I would just say the reason I'm scheduled this week is because this past Wednesday, was International Nonviolence Day. And we are honoring that understanding, and I'll say a little bit about that. But to get started, though, I wanted to just tell you that when Martin Luther King in 1956 was leading the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which launched him into the leadership role of civil rights in this country. He was in Montgomery, Alabama as a pastor at Dexter Avenue Church, and he was leading the boycott of the Montgomery buses, and I'll talk a little more about that in a little bit. But he was speaking to a gathering at the church. His wife and children were at home, and suddenly the wife and children heard something that sounded like a brick hitting the front porch, and then it exploded. It was a bomb. And King didn't know that was happening, and he saw people stirring around that had somehow gotten the message that something was going on. So he asked what was happening. Nobody wanted to tell him, but finally I think Ralph Abernathy told him what had happened, and he said, well, is Coretta okay, or the kids? And he said, we're trying to find that out. So you can imagine what he was experiencing. He got home as quickly as he could, went into the house. Coretta and the kids were fine. There wasn't a lot of damage. But there was a crowd that gathered outside in his front yard area, a large crowd of African Americans who were just angry as they could be. So he stepped out on the front porch, and I want to read something that's found in his autobiography that he said to the people who were out there on the porch. We believe in law and order. Don't get panicky. Don't do anything panicky at all. Don't get weapons. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Remember, that is what God said. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them, love them, and let them know you love them. I did not start this boycott. I was asked by you to serve as your spokesman. I want it known, the length and breadth of this land, that if I am stopped, this movement will not stop. If I am stopped, our work will not stop. For what we're doing is right. What we're doing is just. And God is with us. Now, his home had just been bombed, and he goes out and he basically says to the people, don't get angry, don't get violent, and practice love. He was such an amazing, amazing man. History is often changed, as we all know, by violent means. You just think of the American Revolution, the Civil War, the World War I, World War II, assassination of President Kennedy, assassination of Dr. King himself, 9/11. You think of any of those events, life was different before them, life was very different after them. It's changed. We all know that violence can change history. But we also know that history is changed by nonviolent means. democracy is designed for a nonviolent way of changing things. And of course, the vote is what we all know is the core way that we do that. But there are other ways we do it which are nonviolent as well, in which we write letters, we speak up, we use this day and time social media. We work in organizations to change history, and we talk to legislators to get them to change history. There are a lot of ways to do it, all of which are nonviolent. But what happens when democracy is denied? What happens when the democratic system breaks down? And that is certainly what happened during the Jim Crow era, which we'll talk about. That African Americans did not have the right to vote. They did not have a say-so in the politics of the society. They certainly did not institute Jim Crow laws of segregation across the South. So what was available to them? That was certainly violence might have been available, and there are some instances of that in the history of African Americans in this country, mostly going back to the slave era. But there were things that were available, and the leadership, fortunately for this country, in my estimation, under Dr. King, had to do with educating. There were boycotts, strikes, peaceful assembly, demonstrations, and we'll go into some of those even more as we go forward. But to understand the nonviolent movement in this country, you have to have an understanding of Gandhi. Gandhi, of course, never came to this country, but Gandhi said, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. Don't you just love that? An eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. He also said, I object to violence because when it appears to do good, the good is only temporary. The evil it does is permanent. Gandhi lived from 1869 to 1948. He was born a Hindu in British-ruled India, but he went to London, received a law degree from the University College at London, and then very shortly afterwards went to South Africa to practice law because there was a significant Indian population in South Africa at the time. And the Indians in South Africa experienced the same thing that the African South Africans experienced, which is apartheid, and they experienced discrimination and dehumanization. And he became, Gandhi did, the leader of an Indian civil rights movement in South Africa. And by the, I just mark here, and it's getting ahead of the story, he later died from violence in India in 1948. But he basically arrived at his philosophy of nonviolence, and nonviolence as a means of social change while he was in South Africa. Gandhi returned to India in 1915. He became a leader of the Indian National Congress. Now, he did recruit people for the army in World War I, but he pledged not to take a life himself. Gandhi led a non-cooperation movement that resulted in his arrest. Non-cooperation in the sense that he didn't cooperate with some of the rules that were in place in India to control the Indian population by the British authorities. He told people to remain nonviolent, no matter what. There was a massacre in Amritsar when hundreds of Sikh and Hindu civilians were gunned down by British soldiers. The people had gathered together to protest the taking away of civil liberties and the fact that the British had reinstituted the idea that they could arrest anybody for no reason and could incarcerate them for no reason. And that was to try to prevent an uprising, to try to prevent revolution in the country that would overthrow the British rule in India. He told people, though after this, there were a lot of people who wanted to get revenge because literally hundreds were killed. Now, perhaps the thing that Gandhi's is noted for the most is the Salt March to the Sea in 1930. In the late 18th century, the British rule established a policy whereby Indians were not allowed to make salt. Only British could make salt. Now you think water, you think air, and you think salt are all very essential to everybody, all kinds of living folks. So it was something that was very important at a very basic level to the poorest of the poor, as well as to the aristocracy. So Gandhi chose the laws that said that only the British could make salt, and they taxed people. They could only make it, and they could only sell it, and they taxed people, and it made up over 8% of the British income from taxation in India. So he chose that as a place to be symbolic. And this is one of the things you find about the nonviolent protest movements. They often choose something that is highly symbolic to deal with. And this is something that some people really laughed at him, including some of the British leadership, when he first said he was going to have a salt strike, and then he was going to have a march. He led a march across India, 240 miles, walking across India, started out with a group of folks, maybe 60 or so, ended up with tens of thousands of people along the way, and more than 60,000 were arrested during that time because they were seen as a threat by the British authorities. He was arrested, and the marchers went on to the salt works that were at a particular town on the coast of India, and there when they got to the salt works, the British Army was there, and they severely beat them, fractured skulls, broken bones, and so forth. But what was interesting was, even without Gandhi there, with Gandhi off in jail from being arrested earlier, they did not respond with violence. They had gotten the message, and they were still being nonviolent. Now, the spiritual roots of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, one is the notion of ahisma, which is a Hindu, Buddhist, Jainist belief that it is wrong to harm any living being, and that when we harm others, we harm ourselves because we all partake of the same existence. The other term that was used by Gandhi was a mixture of two words, satya and agraha, or satyagraha. Satya is truth, and Dr. King loved this phrase, satyagraha, because he thought the word truth equaled love. And so he thought in terms of a love force. Now, a little background here. Gandhi was influenced some by the message in the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus. And of course, Dr. King was a Baptist preacher, and he saw the linkage very much between that and the nonviolent philosophy about turn the other cheek and don't seek revenge and love your enemies. And all of that was sort of wrapped up together in the philosophy. I love this picture of Dr. King. It has a picture of Gandhi on the wall of his home, and the picture is taken with him near that. Dr. King is quoted as saying, "Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. It is a sword that heals. Nonviolence is absolute commitment to the way of love." Now, I'm going to tell a little bit of my story, and it's going to start 400 years ago. But in case you're worried, I'm not 400 years old. When I talk about my civil rights journey to 4th and 5th graders, there's always somebody that holds up their hands at question and answer time and says, how old are you? But my 400-year-old civil rights story, you may know that back on August 20th, we celebrated the 400, or not celebrated, but we marked the 400-year anniversary of the first slaves that were brought to this country. They were brought to Jamestown on August 20th, 1619, 400 years ago, and they were purchased with food by Governor Yardley and Cape merchant Abraham Piercy. Now, Abraham Piercy happened to be one of my many 12th great grandfathers, and I've traced my ancestry back to him. Now, if you know anything about ancestry, you know there's an exponential growth of grandfathers as you go back. So he was one of over 8,000. But nevertheless, I have to say that that's part of my heritage. Not a part of my heritage I'm very proud of by any means, but it is part of my heritage that Cape merchant Abraham Piercy and the governor of Jamestown traded food for the first 19 slaves to come to this country. There's a whole story behind that, but I won't tell you. But nevertheless, what you do probably need to know is that more than 600,000 slaves came to America before the Revolutionary War. Now, some of my ancestors owned slaves. They were small farm owners for the most part, with 1 to 7 slaves. And I've documented that in my genealogy, where I've gone back and I found wills that willed slaves to children, where there is record of slave sales. And it's not anything I'm very proud of. But when slavery ended, Jim Crow segregation took its place. Now, you may have heard of Jim Crow laws, but what is that about? Well, Jim Crow was not a person. He was a depreciating minstrel caricature of African Americans. White folks used to love minstrel shows. That was when white people dressed up and blackened their faces and made fun of African Americans for their own amusement. And everybody thought it was hilarious. In fact, in the early movies, and I can remember in the 1940s going to the movies and seeing minstrel characters in the movies, and that they would dance and make fun of African Americans, and they would portray them as lazy, as dumb, and all of the negative characteristics they could. It was a part of the dehumanizing process. In order to have slaves and in order to have segregation, you had to dehumanize. And that was carefully done by white folks, including my ancestors, for generations. So the Jim Crow laws refer to segregation laws designed to perpetuate a less than human image and consideration of the rights of people of color. Now, I want to tell a little personal story here. When I was in the 3rd grade, I went to school in Sewanee, Tennessee. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But Sewanee, Tennessee was in Franklin County, Tennessee, located on top of a mountain in East Tennessee. And it was a very segregated town. The school was very segregated. But the principal and teacher of my class decided that it would be a great event to put on a minstrel show. And so we children were cast in the roles of people in this minstrel show, and the dialogue we would use was supposed to make fun of African American speech, which was intended to be hilarious to the audience. I was cast, ironically, as a black preacher. And it was my job to perform a marriage and of 2 people, And it was a kind of, again, supposed to be a mock thing going on. Now, unbeknown to me, and unbeknown to anybody else involved, one day I would become a white pastor of an African-American congregation. But that was way off in the future. The thing that was supposed to be hilarious in this minstrel was, as I performed the wedding, I stopped in the middle of it before I gave the vows to the couple, who were also black-faced, and I was black-faced. Before I gave them, I pulled a sandwich out of my pocket and ate it. And that was supposed to be absolutely hilarious. Now, when I think back about it, it embarrasses me how dehumanizing that whole thing was. I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute. Segregation was the law of the land in the American South until 100 years after the end of the Civil War. Those laws were enforced by the police. The Ku Klux Klan used terrorism to force people to obey. Here's something that we all need to know. 4,743 African Americans were lynched by the Ku Klux Klan and white mobs between 1882 and 1968. Most lynchings were of young African American males. Sometimes women were also victims of the lynchings. Now I want to, again, a little bit more of my ancestry. My grandfather, Baggett, served a church in Nashville, Tennessee in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan was active. My grandfather stood in the pulpit one Sunday and he basically tore the Klan apart. And he talked about these cowardly hooded people out trying to do what they were trying to do. And the word must have gotten to the local Klan leadership. And a couple of weeks later, on a Sunday night, he was having a Sunday evening service at the Methodist Church. And members of the Klan showed up in their white robes. And they marched down the aisle. And they picked up the offering plate, which had already been taken, and there was money, and they slung it around the church. My grandfather, who often had more courage than he had sense, stood there in the pulpit and called them a bunch of cowards. They left. As far as he knew, as far as any of us knew, they never came back. But those were interesting times, to say the least. Nashville was a hotbed of the Ku Klux Klan, and that was where he was, and that's where I later grew up. But I wanted to talk about growing up here. You see on the left, that's me in 1944, that little sweet little thing you see there. And then you see a picture there of an African-American classroom. See the pot-bellied stove? People don't have desks. The kids don't have desks. They're sitting on little benches around the edge on a wooden floor there. And it doesn't look very inviting. On the right was, at the same time period, what a white classroom looked like. And you can see those desks. I remember sitting in one of those desks. Some of you may have too, if you're old enough. What I'm missing in that, the only thing missing in that picture is at the top of the behind the bulletin boards in the classroom where I was, there were pictures of all the presidents. But otherwise, my classroom looked just like that. Down below here, you see a white water fountain and a colored water fountain. They're not the same water fountains. The one on the left is cooled. The one on the right is not. Then you see white and colored restrooms, sign for that. And in the town I grew up, those signs were everywhere. I had an uncle who ran a service station, and there was a white male service station restroom and a white female service station restroom, but there was no place for people of African American descent or any other colored descent to use the restroom. And he was prone to just, if somebody stopped and wanted to use the restroom and they weren't white, he'd send them on their way. That was the South that we lived in. 1954, things began to change. Desegregation of schools began. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that separate schools were always unequal. And the point here is that the justification for segregated schools in the South was that they were separate, but they were equal. But you could tell from that picture I showed you, there wasn't much equal about them. They were separate. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided if they're separate, they're unequal. And that was a huge decision, and they basically ordered schools to be integrated, but gave them some time to do so. Now, I'm going to continue some of my own story. In 1954-55, I was a freshman at Martin College in Pulaski, Tennessee. It was a church-related college, junior college. And you can't see it right now, but very well. But on the left side of the screen there is a plaque honoring where the Ku Klux Klan was organized. It was originally organized in Pulaski in a judge's office, and that sign is still on the side of the building in Pulaski. This is a picture of the Giles County Courthouse. The jail was in the basement of the courthouse. Now, I show you that because when I went to this junior Christian college, sometime during the year, I experienced the call to become a preacher. And I let some of my buddies know that I was going to become a preacher. And a group of them said, well, then we want you to preach your first sermon at the jail downtown. And this was a little group of students who went every Sunday afternoon and held a service in the jail. So I went with them, and we walked right by this sign down to the jail. And when I got into jail, I can proudly tell you the first congregation I ever preached to was integrated. It was the only place you could find a group of blacks and whites together. They were locked in a jail, and it was the only place that was integrated in the whole county where we were. But I've always been kind of proud of the fact that my first sermon was to an integrated audience. Now, let me talk a little bit about 1955, public accommodations and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Public accommodations, this is part of what was most humiliating to people of African American descent. That included buses, lunch counters, motels and hotels, movie theaters. And the buses, African Americans had to ride in the back. Now, if you lived in an area where there were significant population of African Americans, it wasn't just the very back of the bus. They would mark off the last few rows of bus seats. And that's what was true in Montgomery when the bus boycott began. I'll talk about that some more. Lunch counters. You go into any kind of drugstore, department store, they all had lunch counters in those days. And there were always signs that said whites only in the lunch counters. If you were African American, you could go in and shop and buy stuff at every counter in the store, but you couldn't sit and order a meal at the lunch counter. And that, again, was part of what was very humiliating. I might share with you as well. When I was in high school, I was a soda jerk. I worked in a drugstore at a lunch counter, and we had a sign that said whites only. It was so well known that I never had to turn anybody away because nobody ever showed up to be turned away. But it was a humiliating thing. Motels and hotels, movie theaters. Used to go to the movies on Saturday afternoon. If you were African American, you had to sit in the balcony. Everybody else could sit on the main floor, but you were not ever supposed to mix. Now the bus boycott, which many of you have heard the story there of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a seamstress who worked in downtown Montgomery. She got on the bus one day and she sat maybe 5 or 6 seats in front of the back, but in the area that where you're supposed to be if you were African American. But they had more white people get on the bus that day than they expected. And so the bus driver gets up and goes back and asks her to move so a white person could sit down. And she refused to move. And she said to him, "My feet is tired." And she refused to move. Well, the bus driver got the police there, and they arrested her. And she was not the first one to ever be arrested for that, but that was seen by the leadership, by Dr. King and others, that was seen by the leadership of the black community as being what they were looking for. She was a very good symbol. And so they built this Montgomery Bus Boycott around this woman and her refusal to ride the buses. And what happened was they asked the black community to boycott the buses, nonviolent, boycott the buses. And they did. They were very successful in doing it. And one of the ways they did it was they had taxi drivers who would taxi people to work for 10 cents a ride, which meant it cost them money to do it. But that's what it cost to ride the bus, was 10 cents. So people were used to paying 10 cents to get to work. Jim Cook, you're sitting over here, hold up your hand. Jim Cook lived in Montgomery at the time, and Jim was also participated in helping people get around the bus boycott to get to where they needed to go. And what took great courage for a young white man to do that in those days. This catapulted Dr. King to a great place of leadership in this country. Now, I attended Kentucky Wesleyan College, another church-related college, in 1955 through 1958. So I went to that junior college for a year and transferred. This is part of my story, I'll tell you. My grandfather, that I mentioned earlier, was a president of this college a few years earlier and had moved the college from a different place in Kentucky to its current place in Owensboro, Kentucky. So he was in that position, and he was also a member of the board of trustees of the college. I tell you that because in my junior year, I got together with a couple of other people, and we decided that given the decision of the Supreme Court that the public schools should not be segregated anymore, we got together and we started a petition to integrate Kentucky Wesleyan College. And we passed that around, we made speeches, we got people to sign it. Some people we had to work real hard on to do that, and some people turned us down. But we got a lot of student signatures. And the president of the college got wind of it, called me into the office one day, and he said, "John, if your grandfather had not been a president of this college and wasn't on the board of trustees, I would expel you right now." And but he didn't do it. And but the board of trustees never saw our petition because he kept it from them. And my grandfather later told me that because I had informed him at some point about it. But I won't keep going with that, but I'll also say I got in trouble in other ways during those years. I was a student pastor of a 2-point charge, which means 2 churches, 12 miles from Owensboro, while I was a student during my junior and senior years. And while I was a student preacher there, I preached against segregation. Now, those Kentucky farmers didn't like that. And they got together and they went to my boss, which was a district superintendent who lived in Owensboro, and they tried to get him to remove me. To his credit, he called me in and he sort of talked to me, and then he decided to let me stay there. But that was a little bit of what was going on in college. Now I want to move on because from there I went to seminary, and this was going on while I was in seminary. I went to seminary at Vanderbilt in Nashville, but the first sit-in movement occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Woolworth's lunch counter. Some of you may never have heard of Woolworth's. That was a department. That was back before Walmart, and they weren't that big, but they were like an oversized drugstore with goods and with lunch counters. And the office workers downtown, all these towns and cities, loved to eat in those lunch counters, but they were segregated. So a group of students decided they were going to integrate the lunch counter. And you had a group of African American students who first went from the black school in Greensboro and sat down at the lunch counter to protest. And when they did that, it was sort of entertaining in ways, because the person who was waiting on the first group that came in says, "I'm sorry, we don't serve Negroes." And their answer was, "That's okay, we don't eat them." But they stayed there and endured all kinds of things. And you can see in this picture a Coke being poured on somebody's head. People were roughed up and abused in a variety of ways. But the sit-in movement spread in 1960 to other places, from Greensboro to Winston-Salem, which was close by, to Richmond, Virginia, and then Nashville, Tennessee. And that sort of gets me back into my story. In February 1960, the Nashville sit-ins were led by Reverend James Lawson. I want you to remember him. Reverend Lawson was a classmate of mine and a good friend of mine while I was at Vanderbilt, and the first African-American student at Vanderbilt University. He had been trained by Dr. King and some other people from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which was used as a center for training purposes for the nonviolent movement in the early days. And Jim was the first African American admitted anywhere at Vanderbilt University, Nashville. He led the civil rights movement, and he led the lunch counter sit-ins. And when it became clear that he was a student at Vanderbilt and he was leading this movement, there was an article and an editorial on one of the Nashville papers about it, a segregation paper, by the way. And so the Board of Trustees of Vanderbilt University expelled Jim from school. And this created a crisis. Following the arrest, the sit-in protesters, the black community, boycotted the Nashville Stores. And by the fall of 1960, that had been effective. The stores did not do well without African American business. And so the boycott actually worked. Reverend Lawson was allowed to graduate from Vanderbilt, but that didn't happen easily. There were 10 professors at the seminary at Vanderbilt, my professors at the school I was attending, who resigned over this and said they would not come back and teach at Vanderbilt unless Jim was allowed to complete his education there. I submitted my letter of resignation and applied to schools in other parts of the country, was admitted a couple of other places by sympathetic schools. But when Jim was allowed back in, the professors came back, all but a couple of them. And I decided to finish my school there as well. And I had many wonderful conversations with Jim I won't go into right now. But I want you to remember him again because he appears a little later in my presentation. Just a quick note about the Freedom Rides in 1961. I'm going through this a little bit in terms of chronology. Segregation in bus and train stations had become illegal. And so the Freedom Riders tested the changes in the law. And Klan members beat the Freedom Riders and burned a bus in Alabama. You see James Berg there, who's been beat up and was in the hospital. And you see the bus burning there. And in this particular piece of it, people were not killed, but people were seriously injured. Now I want to move on to Chicago, because when I graduated from seminary, my first church was on the south side of Chicago. And I was the pastor first in the Stockyards area of Chicago. Stockyards area of Chicago, let me see if I should have a pointer. Here, it can help you a little bit. This area right here is called today New City. This is a 2005-2009 map. The blue area is white. The green area is almost 100% black. Then the other shades are mixes. And it hadn't changed a lot since I was in Chicago in the early 1960s. My first church was in the Stockyards area, which at that time was made up almost entirely of Eastern European immigrants who had been stockyard workers. And my church was one Protestant church, small church, in a 12 square block area where there were 12 large Roman Catholic churches. It was an interesting place to serve, to say the least. My second church was in this neighborhood that's called Woodlawn, and I'll talk about that in some depth as we go forward. It was an all African American community then and continues that way today. And then the third place I lived in Chicago when I was on the faculty of the Ecumenical Institute in Chicago is right there, and again in an all black neighborhood called West Garfield. And that is a neighborhood that has for years and continues today to have the highest murder rate in the city of Chicago. So it has some history. It's also the neighborhood that Dr. King moved into when he went to Chicago and said he was going to live in the slums of Chicago and lead the movement there. We'll get back to that shortly. Now, I moved to Chicago in 1961. In the summer of 1963, my youngest child was born. I already had two children. And 2 weeks later, a riot broke out a few blocks away in one of these mostly Catholic neighborhoods that were adjacent to the neighborhood I was in. And a group of clergy decided that we were going to go stand between the rioters and a black family that had moved into this all-white neighborhood. Now, the thing that I showed you a moment ago shows that segregation in neighborhoods is a big thing in Chicago. And that's what Dr. King tried to address later. But here a family had moved from an all-black neighborhood across the railroad tracks into a white neighborhood and moved in, and there were rioters out there throwing things at the house, threatening to do harm to the family and so forth. So a group of us clergy got together, and it was the first time I'd ever worn a clerical collar. But it was because I grew up in the South, you know, as a Protestant pastor, you don't wear a clerical collar. But because it was a Catholic community, we thought we'd get a little more respect there. And we may have, because I'm still living today, but I'll tell you, I had Coke bottles thrown at me, I got cursed, I got shoved. But one of the things that happened to me that I love is that people were really angry that we were there trying to protect this African-American family that had moved in. And so somebody kept yelling at me because they saw my clerical collar. Are you really a father? Are you really a father? And I thought about my son that had just been born. I said, yes, I'm a father. Segregation existed in most northern cities. Neighborhood segregation was perpetuated by housing, discrimination, and the threat of violence, as we just talked about. School segregation also existed in the North, but school segregation was because of neighborhood segregation. there was a strong commitment on the part of the school board and the superintendent of schools to maintain school segregation. School segregation was perpetuated. Now in this picture, you'll see, that's me right there. And that's a picture that appeared on the front page of the afternoon newspaper in Chicago, the Chicago American. And it says segregated Chicagoland on it. And you can see my neighbor back there was wearing a clerical collar. I am too, but you can't see it for the sign. But we were protesting a site where a movement had begun shortly before around school segregation. The leader of the Chicago school desegregation movement was an African-American single mom of 6 children named Rosie Simpson. Now, I want you to remember her because she comes into my story later as well. She did not want her children to receive an inferior education, so she led protest demonstrations. Now, what happened was, in order to not transport African-American kids to white schools where there were empty classrooms, they brought in mobile classrooms and into the black neighborhood to keep it segregated. And so she protested this because schools were not supposed to be segregated since 1954. And she led a movement. She named those mobile classrooms Willis wagons because Willis was the school superintendent, and she protested that. And if you Google her, you still find the articles about this on the internet. But she did not want her children to receive an inferior education. So she also lay down in front of the bulldozers that were making a straight place or a clean place to put the mobile classrooms. So the bulldozers couldn't do their work without running over her. And other brave people in the community did the same thing. One of those brave people that was involved in this before I got involved in it is a candidate for president right now, Bernie Sanders. He was a student at the University of Chicago, and he was arrested at this site, same site, where, as you saw a few minutes ago, I also protested. 1963 was the March on Washington. You remember this image, I know, and remember the eloquent speech that Dr. King made about I have a dream. And it was attended by, as you can see in the picture, thousands of people who came to Washington. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. It was an act to end school segregation and discrimination in public accommodations. It was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. Now I want to talk about Selma. The 1965 Selma March and Voting Rights Act. African Americans had a right to vote, legal right to vote, but particularly across the Jim Crow South, they were systematically denied the right to vote. African Americans experienced discrimination in voting. The Ku Klux Klan made itself known to terrorize people who might want to vote. If you had a meeting in a church that was a black church in rural South, and you tried to get a rally of people together to march down to sign up to vote, that church was in danger of being burned down, and many churches were burned down. The legislators in these states across the South, many of them passed laws making it more difficult to vote. A poll tax was used. Poll tax required you to pay money in order to vote, and so it was a tax, and it hit the poorest people, and of course that tended to be African Americans the hardest. But then sometimes it was just simply by blocking doors to voter registration places. And in southern Alabama, when the civil rights movement began to try to do something about the voting rights there, people bravely went to register to vote, and they were removed physically by police officers, by sheriffs and so forth in that process. It was a very dangerous thing to want to vote. And I show you a picture here of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was killed by state troopers in Marion, Alabama, about 35 miles from Selma in 1965. The first Selma March was in a response to his death. And it began on March 7th, 1965. And the citizens of Selma, Alabama, wanted to march 50 miles to protest voter discrimination. The 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery, which was the capital. The marchers were stopped on the bridge leading out of town. They were tear gassed and beaten by law enforcement officers until they turned back. This came to be known as Bloody Sunday, and many were injured that day. Now, I was in Chicago, and I was watching a movie called Judgment at Nuremberg. And they broke into the movie and showed us these pictures of people being gassed and people being clubbed and beaten by the sheriff and his men. By the way, the sheriff's deputies were mostly also Klan members, and being beaten. And when I saw that, I said, I've got to go to Selma. And so I'll continue that story. Martin Luther King led a second march 2 days later, and in order to prevent people from being injured and prevent more violence, he stopped in the middle of the bridge, did not get close enough to the deputies for them to club them again, and led them back. However, that was not the end of the violence. That night, Reverend James Reid, who had marched with them that day, a Unitarian pastor from New England, was beaten to death. Now, I had also had my very best friend named Jerry Forshey was in Selma that week, and he was with Reid at a place where they were getting a bite of supper in downtown Selma. And Reid left with a couple of other people a little bit before Jerry did. And as he was walking away, going back to the black community where they were staying, some ruffians jumped him, beat him to death, and left him for dead on the road, on the street. Now, I arrived in Selma on Thursday of that week, and I'll share with you, I said I decided to go to Selma. I had never been on a plane before then. And I got on the plane and I flew to Atlanta, and then from Atlanta, I flew to Montgomery. When the plane got to Montgomery, it was not a great plane, but it was crowded, and there were a bunch of other people on the plane who were going to Selma. When we got to Montgomery, Montgomery Airport was all fogged in. And so we were up in the plane looking down. Remember, I'd never been on a plane before, so this was bothering me. I could see nothing but clouds below. And they said that the clouds were so low that the plane couldn't land there. So eventually they were routed on to Meridian, Mississippi. Now that was not a very good place for a bunch of civil rights volunteers to be landing. We landed in Meridian, and they had a bus there for us to take us back to Montgomery, supposedly. And as we started to get on the bus, there was a man driving the bus who spoke to us in a very strong Southern drawl. "Hello, boys." and one of the priests, one of the Catholic priests that was also among those who were going there to participate in the march, said to me, "I think we're in trouble." We were not in trouble. In fact, the man was kind enough to drive through Selma on the way to Montgomery and let us off at Brown's Chapel Church, which was the heart of the civil rights movement. But it was a little bit of a nervous ride. to say the least. Now, there are other parts of that story that I won't tell, but I was arrested on March 13, 1965, during a march through the Selma Mayor's neighborhood. Over here to the left, you see Reverend Jim Bevel, one of Dr. King's aides. Bevel was sort of leading the Selma movement, and it was he that invited King to come and lead the march. They had marched without King first, and then Dr. King came and marched the second time. And then the third time, King would lead the march. But Jim Bevel was a great preacher. And I remember being in Brown's Chapel Church in the balcony, and we sang civil rights songs, and I mean to tell you, that place was rocking. And if you're sitting in a balcony and the church is rocking, you're not sure what's going to happen next. But anyhow, he preached this great sermon, and it was in the afternoon, on a Thursday afternoon. And he challenged us to go and risk laying down our lives. And so you knew when you were leaving to do the march that was a possibility. And that's something interesting. Now, I would say this, that when you went to Selma, they spent time teaching you nonviolence. They spent time teaching you that you didn't strike back, and they taught you how to sort of get down and protect your head from getting clubbed in, but you weren't ever supposed to fight back in any kind of way. So that day, we marched out of the church, we marched down through the black neighborhood, and we marched out into the neighborhood where the mayor lived. And there were people who came out on their porches, and they waved their guns at us. A couple of people fired their guns in the air to make sure we knew they were loaded. And they yelled at us and intimidated us in every way they could. It wasn't long when we were marching through the neighborhood that the sheriff had gotten a couple of school buses to come pack us into and take us back to jail. And so we were marched up to the school buses. We were routed there. There was a guy right in front of me, and one of the neighbors came up while we were waiting to get on the school bus and just cold cocked that guy with his fist. And he started bleeding from the mouth. When they put us in the school buses, they packed us in like sardines. And it was, you could just hardly breathe. I was toward the back of it, and it was just suffocating. The school bus then took us to this area. This is the courthouse in Selma, and this is a parking area. This is a picture taken much later, many years later. But it was a vacant parking lot at the time, and they had us stand in the sun with our arms behind our backs, and this is Selma, southern Alabama, hot sun, even though it was spring. And they had us standing there for a long period of time, and these deputies, who were also Klan members, had their billy clubs in their hand, and they were going around acting like they were going to do something. Come to find out, about 2 hours after standing there, for about 2 hours, and I was glad I was young enough to handle it, I probably couldn't now. About standing there a couple of hours after that, they figured out that their jail was full, and they didn't have room for any more people in jail. So what they did was, they marched us a couple of blocks away to this building, which was a youth center. And there they herded us into the youth center. So I spent a night in this building. All of this is a complex there. This is the white building you see here. And this is a picture of me many years later. But this is the building where they kept us. And the rumor was that we had to stay there overnight. And the rumor was that the Ku Klux Klan was going to come and firebomb the place while I was there. So I didn't sleep very well that night. I didn't sleep at all. It was just a concrete floor. And we kept our eyes on what was happening and tried to stay away from the windows as best we could. But it was not an easy, safe place to be. You have to again remember that the Klan were also members of the sheriff's deputies, so they knew exactly how to get to us. And so we fortunate. We made it through the night. That was my first time to ever have any contact with Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was in the room with us, and he inspired us, and he in the next morning he led us on the march back to the church, Brown's Chapel Church, where we continued the week. Now, the third big Selma March was on Sunday, March 21st, 1965, and there were hundreds of us, probably thousands, from around the country who came. And you can, right up here, it was a podium where Dr. King spoke. I was somewhere right in there. You can't see it on this photograph. But we gathered there. We took communion together, and then we heard Dr. King speak, and then we started the march. We marched across the bridge, the same bridge where they had been beaten before. That bridge is still there. It's kind of a landmark in Selma. And you can see Dr. King and Coretta King leading the march that day. Now, this time the marchers were protected by the National Guard. The feds had called out the National Guard to provide us some protection. And so as we marched along, what we heard a lot of were helicopters whirring and tanks making noises because the National Guard had brought everything and was business. Fortunately, we safely marched across. Nobody tried to stop us at the bridge. And we marched a full day, a long day, that day. And at that point, the court order that had been used to support the march, the feds had made possible, said only 50 marchers were allowed by court order to continue. That included Dr. King, that included some of his staff, and that included a selected group of marchers. I was not in that group, and most of us were not. What happened to us was we were put on a train that took us back to Selma. Now that evening, I needed to get back to Chicago to my church there. So that evening, I said I'm going to go. A lot of people did go back home that night. But here's what I want you to know. In order to get from Selma to Montgomery, which is 50 miles, and that's where they were walking to, so it was a dangerous road, an African-American couple drove me to the airport. They insisted, and they were right, that I lay on the floorboard of the back seat and cover myself with a blanket so that the Ku Klux Klan would not see a white face in their car. And that we would have a chance to make it safely to Montgomery and back. They would have a chance to. That becomes even more important later in what I say. But anyhow, I flew into Montgomery. There I found a friend of mine from Chicago. His name was Reverend John Porter, an African-American clergyman. And he was a good friend of mine who had done a good job of raising me up in the civil rights movement. He headed up what was called then the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Chicago branch. A little bit of an oxymoron, but it was nevertheless, he knew the Kings personally. He was a great civil rights leader, friend of mine, and later on we worked very closely together. But at any rate, we got on the plane together, and as we got on the plane together and headed back to the assigned seats, he said, "Do you know who that is back there?" I looked, I did know who it was, and it was Coretta King. And so we went back. She spoke to John, he introduced me to her, and I sat next to Coretta as we flew the plane back to Atlanta where she was going. And then, of course, we went on to Chicago, John and I did. But we had a very interesting conversation. She talked about the bombing. She talked about how every day they knew could be the last day that any of them, including their children, might live, and how committed they were to nonviolence, how committed they were to the movement, and to bringing about change in this society. And I was deeply moved by that, and I must say later on, after Dr. King was assassinated, I wept as I remembered that conversation. The march ended in Montgomery, Alabama, the state capital, a few days later, and then thousands of people joined that, 50 people who marched up Highway 80 from Selma to Montgomery, where Dr. King spoke. Now, after the event in Montgomery, people were going home, and this woman was a volunteer, Viola Leotso, a mother of 5 from Detroit, and she and one of the African-American members of the team there in Selma were driving back on the Highway 80, the same one I had ridden on covered with the blanket, and they were fired upon by members of the Ku Klux Klan, and she was killed, as was the young man who was driving. It was not a safe place to be. I've always felt very fortunate to have survived it. President Johnson immediately asked Congress to pass his voting rights bill, which is what Selma was all about. And on August 6, 1965, it was signed into law, and it stopped states from passing laws and practices to limit the voting rights of African Americans and other minorities. I didn't mention earlier, you're African American, you go to register to vote in southern Alabama, you might be asked to recite the entire Constitution, word for word, as a test. There were other things that they did to try to get you to fail so that you couldn't vote. Now, today there are other methods. We'll mention them a little later. In 1966, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, partly at the invitation of people like my friend Reverend Porter and Rosie Simpson, came to Chicago. And he was to move into the west side of Chicago and to lead movement here. In July, he had a rally at Soldiers Field. I took my whole family, and afterwards we all marched down to City Hall to let the mayor know we wanted the laws to protect African Americans who moved into white communities, and to get rid of redlining. You know what redlining is? Redlining were neighborhoods that the realtors drew red lines around and said, we won't sell to African Americans in those neighborhoods. A practice all over northern cities. The Chicago campaign was focused on housing discrimination. We marched through all white neighborhoods. I marched with Dr. King through a couple of neighborhoods. Some people threatened us and threw rocks at us. We sang civil rights songs and remained nonviolent. On one of these marches, that I was with Dr. King on, I went back to get my car to drive home. And as I was pulling out of the parking area, a bunch of young white boys started throwing rocks and bricks. And my car got seriously damaged in the process. I'll tell you, it was not, Dr. King once said that of all the hate he experienced and all the ugliness that he experienced in the South, it was worse in Chicago. And I understand why he said that. Although I can tell you, I had some awful things said to me when I was marching in Selma as well. But neither one was fun. But hate didn't seem to know any boundaries. In the late 1960s, I served a church called Woodlawn Methodist Church. Woodlawn was the neighborhood I pointed out earlier to you, an all-black neighborhood south of the University of Chicago. Had turned African American a few years before that. It was a very poor community. Spent a lot of time with people who were struggling economically tremendously. That church is a large building, and that was a gift and a problem, but nevertheless, it was one I was determined we were going to use for some good purpose. And one of the things that I realized was that one of the things I realized was that we really did need to do something to deal with what I would say is the internalization of depreciation that had occurred to African Americans. You know, for generations, the white culture had made many African Americans, had convinced themselves many African Americans were subhuman. Well, what I found in getting to know people in the black community was many black people at that time had internalized a lot of that and had very negative self-understandings of themselves. So we created something called the School of Human Dignity, and it was designed to try to build African American pride in people. And it was designed to try to give people a sense of the glory of African American history and culture. So we put together classes and we taught people about the wonderful African American cultural history, including the Civil Rights Movement, but going back to the great civilizations of Africa. And we talked about how, and you've heard this phrase before, black is beautiful. That was something that people didn't really believe. And so we spent time with that. One of the wonderful things that happened with that, from my point of view, is that others outside our community heard about it. And among those was Jesse Jackson, who at that time was doing Operation Breadbasket in Chicago. And that organization began to send people to Woodlawn to take our classes. And included in that were all the school principals in Chicago, because he had negotiated that as a part of his deal with them. It was teachers in Chicago, teachers in the school system. The executive heads of Montgomery wards. Some of you don't know what Montgomery wards is, but that was a Sears in those days. That was before Walmart too. And all these executives came and took our class. We had hundreds of people that were sent to us by Jesse Jackson because he was negotiating these deals with these businesses and requiring not only that they provide jobs for African Americans, but that they come and learn about African American culture and history and the history of white racism in this country to make them more sensitive to touch their hearts and minds. So we did some of that as well, and I'm very, very pleased with that work. I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the assassination of Dr. King. In this picture of Dr. King here, this is somebody I showed you before. This is my classmate, Jim Lawson. Jim became a pastor in Memphis, and he's the one that invited Dr. King to Memphis for the garbage strike. Of course, that turned to have a tragic ending. You see the sign down here, I am a man. That was a theme of the Memphis piece, and that also is part of what I was saying earlier, is that dehumanization needed to be countered. And so part of what began to happen in the civil rights movement is that people began to learn that African Americans are human. And among those that learned it were African Americans. You could see I've got an I am a man button on tonight. Some of you can't see that back there, but I've got one on. A friend of mine, Polly Perlow, was in Memphis, and there's a museum now at the motel where Dr. King was assassinated, and she picked one of these up for me, and I really appreciate it. But I Am a Man was part of the story there. On April 3rd, 1968, Dr. King had a premonition that he was going to be killed. Now, the story is that Dr. King got on a plane in Atlanta to fly back to Memphis after going home from being there before. And And they wouldn't take off for a while because he was on the plane. They wanted to check it for bombs. And so I think that may have contributed to his premonition. But at any rate, he talked in his sermon about, I may not get to the mountaintop with you, but we as a people will get to the mountaintop. Great speech. On April 4th, he was assassinated in Memphis by this man, James Earl Ray, who killed Dr. King. Now, an interesting part of this story is, you probably know this story, but Ray was later arrested. He was sent to prison in Tennessee for assassinating Dr. King. Some of the King family were absolutely convinced he acted alone or that he was the murderer. But I will tell you, part of the story is, here's the man who was convicted of killing Dr. King. And James Lawson, who loved Dr. King dearly, and who invited him to Memphis, my old classmate, used to visit him in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. And Jim Lawson ended up marrying James Earl Ray to his sweetheart, performing the ceremony for him. Talk about believing in nonviolence. Talk about believing in the power of love. That was just an amazing kind of demonstration. I've always admired Jim, but I admired him particularly when he did that. Now, riots broke out in major cities following the assassination of Dr. King, and many African Americans were angry that Dr. King had been killed. So there were riots in all the major cities, and my city, Chicago, was hard hit, and my neighborhood, Woodlawn, was hard hit. In Woodlawn, a street gang planned to burn down Mount Carmel High School. Now, Woodlawn was a community in which there was a street gang that was notorious. It's called the Blackstone Rangers. The Blackstone Rangers, some people estimated, had as many as 5,000 members. They were in many ways a violent gang at war with the Devil's Disciples. And the border, the boundary between the Blackstone Rangers territory and the Devil's Disciples territory was the street that ran next to my church. And I won't tell you the whole story right now, but one time I had to get down with my good suit on and crawl across a vacant lot because there was gunfire going on between the two gangs. This was the gang leader, Jeff Ford, and I've got lots of stories about him and the Rangers. But let me just say it for the purposes of tonight. Carmel High School was a Catholic school that was, and probably still is, the preeminent college preparatory Catholic school in Chicago. So it had a lot of white kids in it. And after King was assassinated, the day after King was assassinated, the Rangers got together and they were going to burn down the school with white students in it. And this woman right here, I mentioned earlier, she was the one that organized the school demonstrations, lay down in front of the bulldozers and stuff. Rosie Simpson, she looks a little older here. Rosie was my friend, and Rosie had moved to Woodlawn and worked for the local Woodlawn community organization. And she and I worked on schools as an advocacy area in Woodlawn. And on the day after King was assassinated, we were out delivering chicken dinners to people to raise money for the schools program. And we felt like we had to do it. People had paid for the dinners, and the dinners were ready and so forth. Well, it was a very dangerous place to be on the streets of Woodlawn the day after King was assassinated. We drive up and find this mob of Blackstone Rangers at Mount Carmel High School. And she was the bravest woman I've ever known. We pulled up, I stopped my car. She immediately jumps out, runs and gets in the middle of it. She asks, "Where's Jeff, this guy?" And so she says, "Come on," to me, and I didn't want to get out of the car. But when Rosie tells you to do something, you do it. So I got out of the car, and Rosie and I go find Jeff. Now, she knew Jeff because he had been involved in some teen job training stuff that she had sponsored. And so she went up to him and said, "What's going on here?" And he told her that they were going to burn down the school. And she became that strong African-American mother figure. And she really lit into it. And he just kind of got smaller and smaller. And she said, no, you're not. In fact, let me tell you what you're going to do. You're going to round up your leadership, and you're going to tell them that you're going to go throughout Woodlawn, and you're going to stop the rioting, and you're going to keep places from being burned down, because these are your neighbors, and these are your family, and these are your friends, and they need a place to shop, they need a place to go to school, and need a place to live and work. So she was extremely courageous talking to them, and they were not much in mood for this, but they did respond, and Jeff gets up. We go inside the auditorium of the school. He gets up, all his guys follow him in there, probably 1,000 or 1,200 of them, and he tells them what they're going to do, and that they're going to keep Woodlawn from getting burned down. That was one of my more interesting experiences. The National Guard was called up to end the rioting and keep the peace, and that lasted a couple of days. But there was lasting damage to the community as a result of that. Now, let me just sort of begin to wind up. The dream continues. Major changes have happened, but many challenges remain. And I want to mention some, because this is a lecture about changing history through nonviolent means. Poverty and unemployment is still extremely high in the African American communities. There's a real need for better education, better job training, better job opportunities. There's a real need to address criminalization. The percentages of African Americans incarcerated versus the percentage of whites incarcerated is just horrendous. And there's a real need for programs of aftercare when people come out of the prisons, to help people find jobs and help people reintegrate into society. In the U.S. population, there are 47.4% of the white population is incarcerated. 35.4% of what's in jail are African American, which means that a much higher percentage of African Americans per U.S. population. The black population, 16% of the population, 46% of the imprisoned population. I want to go to Confederate statutes a minute. There are over 1,700 Confederate monuments throughout the nation, 31 states and the District of Columbia. Most were erected between 1890 and 1950. A lot of us white folks don't know why they were erected. They were erected because of Jim Crow laws. They were erected to intimidate African Americans into being obedient to the laws of segregation. And that's one reason they are so offensive to African Americans. And I hear people talking about, remember, I grew up in the South. I am Southern born, Southern bred, Southern ancestry and everything. I grew up with all the mythology about how wonderful the Confederacy was, and how we had all these great heroes fighting for the Confederacy. And I had a couple of ancestors who fought on that side. I had a couple that fought on the Union side. But I would say that we, as a people, need to understand how offensive these statues are to a significant portion of our culture. And we need to understand that's real. Now people say, well, what do you do with the statues? I have an answer to that. When I went back to Selma a few years ago, there is a museum there at the foot of the bridge that we talked about. I went in, and in the museum, there is a figure robed in a Ku Klux Klan robe, and there is a Confederate flag behind it. I thought, what a wonderful place to show the real history, because that museum showed the rest of the history. It put it in context. It'd be like if you went to a Holocaust museum, it'd be all right to see a Nazi flag because it's putting the context of the horrors of what happened there. So I say, put this one of General Lee here in a museum somewhere, but show the whole story of slavery, the horrors of the lynchings. Tell the whole story. If you want to know history, learn the whole history, not just the glorified version that justifies your prejudice. So that's part of it. I also just want, because it's such a big thing these days, say a word about Black Lives Matter. It's a great phrase. And a lot of people are offended by that who are white, thinking, don't you need every life matter? And of course every life matters. And then there's the Blue Lives Matter about police officers. But why do you have the Black Lives Matter movement? And why did people kneel during the national anthem at football players, the professional football players? Because it's not safe if you're an African-American young man to drive a car. Every African-American family I ever knew had to have that conversation with their children about how you need to act if you don't want to be killed from driving while black, DWB. And that's why a lot of people get pulled over. They get pulled over because they're driving while black. And then they're at risk. The other thing I want to say, and I appreciate so much Kathy mentioning the mental health fair that we're going to have in Suntree. If you're African American and you are young and you have a mental health crisis and your parents call 911 to try to get you evaluated because you have a mental health condition, that is likely a death sentence today. Because when the police come, if you're at all acting out, you're at high risk of getting shot. So I think it's important. We white folks need to join the Black Lives Matter movement here. We need to understand that every life is valuable, but particularly understand the history here and understand why it was for generations Black lives didn't matter, but they need to matter today. I won't keep going with those, but just you can see, except for that last one. I wanted to say something about voter suppression. Having risked my life and having known others lost theirs in Selma for voting rights of African Americans, I think it's extremely important that we understand how critical it is that efforts are underway today to limit the rights of African Americans to vote. And that's still being done through some of the old ways, but it's mostly being done through things like voter registration kind of fraud, requiring people to have new driver's licenses or ID cards. That means that if you don't get to the DMV before the time to vote, you may not have the right ID and they can keep you from voting. And if people who have trouble with transportation, who can't get off from work, are going to be less likely to have the ID to vote. And then there's gerrymandering. You know what I mean by gerrymandering? I mean that these legislators get together, these state legislators, that happened in North Carolina when I was there, and they redraw the map, and the map looks like a bunch of squirrely little things because they have identified where black votes are, where white votes are, and they know how people vote, or they have an idea how people are going to vote, and they limit the vote. Now, how un-American can you get to be there? I want to end up by saying about that I love my country, but the thing I love about it are its values. And it's a place where I love the land of the free. And I love the fact that Dr. King loved this country. And he over and over again talked about this country as being a place that is a land of the free and home of the brave. Talked about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is my last slide. If every Negro in the United States turns to violence, I will choose to be that one lone voice preaching that this is the wrong way. Thank you.
Tara's here? See Tara's here? Oh, but here's my hero. Great job.
Well, I'm glad. I'm so glad.